Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to Level-Headed News. I am your host, Brenda, and I have a little show to do for you here about Fidel Castro passing away over the holiday weekend. Thought you might be interested in some information here, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it on out to you. Cuba's communist leader, Fidel Castro, has died at the ripe old age of 90. And this is off of regated.com. Both of the URLs in this newscast are listed in the description of the video, so you can check them out at your leisure for any other information that you might want. I'll go ahead and read this one to you. The loss of life is not an easy thing to experience for families in any capacity. However, what are the feelings toward the death of one of the most brutal dictators in modern world history? A win-lose scenario. Naturally, the loss of Fidel hits his family. However, the win scenario is that we can finally begin to assert actual freedom on the Cuban island. Fidel abdicated his power over his his communist government in 2008 to his brother Raul, citing concerns for his deteriorating health. However, this only occurs after Fidel's nearly 60 years of reign and his long-lasting track record for his killing, controlling, and oppression of the Cuban people. He rose to power after deposing an American-backed military dictator through an effective propaganda campaign and some of the most brutal guerrilla warfare tactics ever utilized. However, his message for equality and social justice for the people of Cuba quickly turned as he began campaigns of censorship, insurrection, and intimidation to dissenters. Under Castro, Communist Cuba relied heavily on the Soviet Union. In fact, the Castro and his Cuba wouldn't have become relevant players if it weren't for the Soviets. Through subsidies and direct funding from the Kremlin, the country began to modernize. However, economic stagnation overtook the country with the justified American trade embargo and dissolution of the Soviet bloc. After 1991, Fidel became the last bastion of Cold War-era communism in the Western Hemisphere, to say the least. Regardless of such facts, the Cubans suffered under Fidel Castro's brand of communism. He censored the press, he limited movement in and to the country, and persecuted blacks, women, homosexuals, and the religious. Cuba's universal health care and education system are failing. Cubans are left in poverty as the country is stuck in the 12th century, all because of Castro's communism. A utopia of equality, Cuba is no more. Through a series of human rights violations on par with Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, he forced his own people to seek shelter and asylum in neighboring Florida. Because of Fidel Castro, Miami and the United States has become a new hope for Cuban Americans who fled, allowing this to serve as testimony to his atrocious brand of extreme leftism. Cuban Americans are more conservative and true advocates for free markets and individual liberty. Castro destroyed families and ended lives. These truths we must realize examining the aftermath of his death. In the time since his death, world leaders and media organizations around the world have toned down the atrocities associated with the dead Cuban. Outlets such as Washington Post, CNN, BBC have called Castro a spiritual beacon, an inspiration, and even firebrand. Such characterizations are downright atrocious and defy reality. World leaders like U.S. President Barack Obama and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also seek to pay their respects, justifying his past existence. We in the free world cannot justify a monster, even in the semblance of his death. And the next article that I have for you is also about Fidel, and this one, if we can get to the top of it here, my goodness, it's a long one. It says, Fidel Castro, Cuban revolutionary who defied U.S., dies at age 90. Mr. Castro brought the Cold War to Western Hemisphere, bedeviled 11 American presidents, and briefly pushed the world into the brink of nuclear war. Fidel Castro, the fiery apostle of the revolution, who brought the Cold War to the Western Hemisphere in 1959 and then defied the U.S. For nearly half a century as Cuba's maximum leader, bewailed 11 American presidents and briefly pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war, died on Friday. He was 90. Cuban state television announced the death but gave no other details. The declining health for several years, Mr. Castro had orchestrated what he hoped would be the continuation of his communist revolution. He died in 2006 when a serious illness failed him. He provisionally ceded much of his power to his youngest brother, Raul, now 85, and 2 years later formally resigned as president. Raul, see something trying to play here, and we got to get that stopped. If I can figure out where it's coming from. Interesting. All right, apparently that quit, whatever it was. Find my place where I left off. Okay, he provisionally ceded much of his power to his younger brother Raul, now 85, and 2 years later formally resigned as president. Raul Castro, who had fought alongside Fidel Castro from the earliest days of the insurrection and remained Minister of Defense and his brother's closest confidant, has ruled Cuba since then, although he has told the Cuban people he intended to resign in 2018. Fidel Castro had held on to power longer than any other living national leader except Queen Elizabeth II. He became a towering international figure whose importance in the 20th century far exceeded what might have been expected from the head of state of a Caribbean island nation of 11 million people. He dominated his country with strength and symbolism from the day he triumphantly entered Havana on January the 8th of 1959 and completed his overthrow Luengo Batista, and by delivering his first major speech in the capital before tens of thousands of admirers at the vanquished dictator's military headquarters. A spotlight shone on him as he swaggered and spoke with passion until dawn. Finally, white doves were released to signal Cuba's new peace. When one landed on Mr. Castro perching on his shoulder, the crowd erupted, chanting "Fidel, Fidel." To the war-weary Cubans gathering there and those watching television, it was an electrifying sign that their young bearded guerrilla leader was destined to be their savior. Most people in the crowd had no idea what Mr. Castro planned for Cuba. Master of image and myth, Mr. Castro believed himself to be the messiah of his fatherland, an indispensable force with authority from on high to control Cuba and its people. He wielded power like a tyrant, controlling every aspect of the island's existence. He was Cuba's Maximo Litter, a Cuban army tank. He directed his country's defense at the Bay of Pigs. Countless details fell to him, from selecting the color of uniforms that Cuba's soldiers wore in Angola to overseeing a program to produce super breed of milk cows. He personally set the goals for sugar harvest. He personally sent countless men to prison. But it was more than a repression and fear that kept him and his totalitarian government in power for so long. He had both admirers and detractors in Cuba and around the world. Some saw him as a ruthless despot who trampled rights and freedoms. Many others hailed him, as the crowds did that first night, as a revolutionary hero for the ages. Even when he fell ill and was hospitalized with diverticulitis in the summer of 2006, giving up most of his power for the first time, Mr. Castro tried to dictate the details of his own medical care and to orchestrate the continuation of his communist revolution, engaging a plan as old as the revolution itself. By handing power to his brother, Mr. Castro once more raised the ire of his enemies in Washington. United States officials condemned the transition, saying it prolonged a dictatorship and again denied the long-suffering Cuban people a chance to control their own lives. But in December of 2014, President Obama used his executive powers to dial down the decades of antagonism between Washington and Havana by moving to exchange prisoners and normalize diplomatic relations between the two countries, with the help of Pope Francis after 18 months of secret talks between representatives of both governments. Though increasingly frail and rarely seen in public, Mr. Castro even then made clear his enduring mistrust of the United States. A few days after Mr. Obama's highly publicized visit to Cuba in 2016, the first by a sitting president, In 88 years, Mr. Castro penned a cranky response, um, denigrating Mr. Obama's overtures of peace and insisting that Cuba did not need anything that the United States was offering. To many, Fidel Castro was self-obsessed zealot whose belief in his own destiny was unshakable, whose economic and political colors were determined more by pragmatism than by doctrine. Beat the heart of a true rebel. Fidel Castro said Riston, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the 1950s and early 60s, was everything a revolutionary should be. Mr. Castro was perhaps the most important leader to emerge from Latin America since the Wars of Independence in the early 19th century. The most influential shaper of Cuban history since his own hero, Jose Marti, struggle for Cuban independence in the late 19th century. Mr. Castro's revolution transformed Cuban society and had a longer-lasting impact throughout the region than that of any other 20th century Latin American insurrection, with the possible exception of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. His legacy in Cuba and elsewhere has been mixed record of social progress and abject poverty, of racial equality and political persecution, of medical advances, and a degree of misery compared to the conditions that existed in Cuba when he entered Havana as commander in 1959. That image made him a symbol of revolution throughout the world and an inspiration to many imitators. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela considered Mr. Castro his ideologically godfather. Marcos began a revolt in the mountains of southern Mexico in 1994 using many of the same tactics. Even Mr. Castro's spotty performance as an aging autocrat in charge of a foundering economy could not undermine his image. But beyond anything else, it was Mr. Castro's obsession with the United States and America's obsession with him that shaped his rule. After he embraced communism, Washington portrayed him as a devil and a tyrant and repeatedly tried to remove him from power through an ill-fated invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. An economic embargo that has lasted decades, assassination plots, and even bizarre plans to undercut his prestige by making his beard fall out. Defiance of American power made him a beacon of resistance in Latin America and elsewhere, and his bushy beard, long Cuban cigar, and green fatigues became universal symbols of rebellion. Mr. Castro's understanding of the power of images, especially on television, helped him retain the loyalty of many Cubans, even during the harshest periods of deprivation and isolation, when he routinely blamed America and its embargo for many of Cuba's ills. And his mastery of words and thousands of speeches, often lasting hours, imbued many Cubans with his own hatred of the United States by keeping them on constant watch for an invasion, military, economic, or ideological, from the North. Mr. Castro gave hundreds of interviews and retained the ability to twist the most compromising question to his favor. In a 1985 interview in Playboy magazine, he was asked how he would respond to President Ronald Reagan's description of him as a ruthless military dictator. Question, Mr. Castro said, toying with his interviewer. If being a dictator means governing by decree, then you might use that argument to accuse the Pope of being a dictator. He turned the question back on Reagan. If his power includes something as monstrously undemocratic as the ability to order thermonuclear war, who then is more of a dictator, the President of the United States or I? After leading his guerrillas against a repressive Cuban dictator, Mr. Castro, in his early 30s, aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union and used Cuban troops to support revolution in Africa and throughout Latin America. His willingness to allow the Soviets to build missile launching sites in Cuba led to a harrowing diplomatic standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union in the fall of 1962, one that could have escalated into a nuclear exchange. The world remained tense until the confrontation was diffused 13 days after it began, and the launching pads were dismantled. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Mr. Castro faced one of his biggest challenges, surviving without huge subsidies He defied predictions of his political demise. When threatened, he fanned antagonism toward the United States. And when the Cuban economy near collapse, he legalized the United States dollar, which he had railed against since the 1950s, only to ban the dollar again a few years later when the economy stabilized. Mr. Castro continued to taunt American presidents for half a century, frustrating all Washington attempts to contain him. After nearly 5 decades as a parish of the West, even when his once booming voice had withered to an old man's whisper and his beard had turned gray, he remained defiant. He often told interviewers that he identified with Don Quixote, and like Quixote, he struggled against the threats, both real and imagined, preparing for decades, for example, for another invasion that never came. As the leaders of every other nation of the hemisphere gathered in Quebec City in April 2001 for the third summit of the Americas, an uninvited Mr. Castro, then 74, fumed in Havana, presiding over ceremonies commemorating the embarrassing defeat of the CIA-backed exiles at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. True to character, he portrayed his exclusion as a sign of strength, declaring that Cuba is the only country in the world that does not need to trade with the United States. Personal powers. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruiz was born on August 13th, 1926, 1927 in some reports, in what was then eastern Cuban province of Oriente, the son of plantation owner Angelo Castro and one of his maids, Linza Ruiz Gonzalez, who became his second wife and had 7 children. The father was a Spaniard who had arrived in Cuba under mysterious circumstances. Reported by Mr. Castro himself was that his father had agreed to take the place of a Spanish aristocrat who had been drafted into the Spanish army in the late 19th century to fight against Cuban independence and American hegemony. Other versions suggest that Angel Castro went penniless to Cuba to try that again. Other versions suggest that Angel Castro went penniless to Cuba, but eventually established a plantation and did business with the despised American-owned United Fruit Company. By the time Fidel was a youngster, his father was major landowner. Fidel was a boisterous young student who was sent away to study with Jesuits at the Colegio de Dolores in Santiago de Cuba, and later to the Colegio de Belén, an exclusive Jesuit high school in Havana. Cuban lore has it that he was headstrong and fanatical even as a boy. In one account, Fidel was said to have bicycled head-on into a wall to make a point to his friends about the strength of his will. In another often repeated tale, young Fidel and his class were led on a mountain hike by a priest. The priest slipped in a fast-moving stream and was in danger of drowning until Fidel pulled him to shore. Then both knelt in prayer of thanks for their good fortune. A sense of destiny accompanied by Mr. Castro as he entered the University of Havana's law school in 1945 and almost immediately immersed himself in radical politics. He took part in an invasion of the Dominican Republic that unsuccessfully tried to oust the dictator Rafael Trujillo. He became increasingly obsessed with Cuban politics and led student protests and demonstrations even when he was not enrolled in the university. Mr. Castro's university days earned him the image of rabble-rouser and seemed to support the view that he had communist leanings all along. But in an interview in 1981, quoted in Tad Sulk's 1986 biography, Fidel, Mr. Castro said that he had flirted with communist ideas but did not join the party. I had entered into contract with Marxist literature, Mr. Castro said. At that time, there were some communist students at the University of Havana, and I had friendly relations with them, but I was not in the socialist youth. I was not a militant in the Communist Party. He acknowledged that radical philosophy had influenced his character. I was then acquiring a revolutionary conscience. I was active. I struggled, but let us say I was an independent fighter. After receiving his law degree, Mr. Castro briefly represented the poor, often bartering his services for food. In 1952, he ran for Congress as a candidate for the opposition Orthodox Party, but the election was scuttled because of a coup staged by Mr. Batista. Mr. Castro's initial response to the Batista government was to challenge it with a legal appeal, claiming that Mr. Batista's actions had violated the Constitution. Even as a symbolic act, the attempt was futile. Radical students gained followers, and on July 26, 1953, Mr. Castro led them in an attack on Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Many of the rebels were killed. The others were captured. As Mr. Castro and his brother Raul at his trial, Mr. Castro defended the attack, issued an order not to discuss the proceedings, but 6 Cuban journalists who had been allowed in the courtroom recorded Mr. Castro's defense. As for me, I know that jail will be hard as it has ever been for anyone, filled with threats, with violence and cowardly brutality, Mr. Castro declared. I do not fear this. I do not fear the fury of the miserable tyrant who snuffed out the life of 70 brothers of mine. Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me. Mr. Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mr. Batista then made what turned out to be a huge strategic error. Believing that the rebels' energy had been spent and under pressure from civic leaders to show that he was not a dictator, he released Mr. Castro and his followers in an amnesty after the 1954 presidential election. Mr. Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he plotted his return to Cuba. He tried to buy a used American PT boat to carry his band to Cuba, but the deal fell through. Then he caught sight of a beat-up 61-foot wooden yacht named Grandma, once owned by an American who lived in Mexico City. The Grandma remains on display in Havana, encased in glass. Man of the Mountains. During Mr. Castro's long rule, his character and his image underwent several transformations, beginning with his days as a revolutionary in the Sierra Maestra of eastern Cuba. After arriving on the coast in the overloaded yacht with Che Guevara and 80 of their comrades in December of 1956, Mr. Castro took on the role of freedom fighter. He engaged in a campaign of harassment and guerrilla, infuriated Mr. Batista, who had seized power in a 1952 garrison revolt, ending in a brief period of democracy. Although his soldiers and weapons vastly outnumbered Mr. Castro's, Mr. Batista grew fearful of the young guerrilla's mesmerizing oratory. He ordered government troops not to rest until they had killed Mr. Castro, and the army frequently reported that it had done so. The world reported his death in December of 1956 landing, but 3 months later, Mr. Castro was interviewed for a series of articles that would revive his movement and thus change history. When Castro loyalists contacted a correspondent and editorial writer for the New York Times, Herbert L. Matthews, and arranged for him to interview Mr. Castro. Orders took Mr. Matthews into the mountains disguised as a wealthy American planter. Drawing on his reporting, Mr. Matthews wrote sympathetically of both the man and his movement, describing Mr. Castro, then 30, parting the jungle leaves and striding into the clearing for the interview. This was quite a man, a powerful 6-foot, olive-skinned, full-faced, with straggly beard, Mr. Matthews wrote. The 3 articles, which began in the Times on Sunday, February 24, 1957, presented a Castro that Americans could root for. The personality of the man is overpowering, Mr. Matthews wrote. There was an educated, dedicated fanatic, a man of ideals, of courage, and remarkable qualities of leadership. The articles repeated Mr. Castro's assertions that Cuba's future was anything but a communist state. He has strong ideas of liberty, democracy, social justice, and need to restore the Constitution to hold elections, Mr. Matthews wrote. When asked about the United States, Mr. Castro replied, "You can be sure we have no animosity toward the United States and the American people." The Cuban government denounced Mr. Matthews and called his articles fabrications, but the news that he had survived the landing breathed life into Mr. Castro's movement. His small band of irregulars skirmished with government troops, and each encountered increasing increased their support in Cuba and around the world, even though other insurgent forces in the cities were also fighting to overthrow the Batista government. It was the symbolic strength of his movement, not the armaments under Mr. Castro's control, that overwhelmed the government. By the time Mr. Batista fled from the darkened Havana airport just after midnight on New Year's Day, 1959, Mr. Castro was already a legend. Competing opposition groups were unable to seize power. Events over the next few months became the catalyst for another transformation in Mr. Castro's public image. More than 500 Batista-era officials were brought before court-martials and special tribunals, summarily convicted and shot to death. The grainy black and white images of the executions broadcast on American television horrified viewers. Mr. Castro defended the executions as necessary to solidify the revolution. He complained that the United States had raised not a whimper when Mr. Batista had tortured and executed thousands of opponents. But not to wary observers in the United States, the executions were a signal that Mr. Castro was not the democratic savior he had seemed. In 1959, he began confiscating privately owned agricultural land, including land owned by Americans, openly provoking the United States government. In the spring of 1960, Mr. Castro ordered American and British refineries in Cuba to accept oil from the Soviet Union. Under pressure from Congress, President Dwight D. Eisenhower cut the American sugar quota from Cuba, forcing Mr. Castro to look for new markets. He turned to the Soviet Union for economic aid and political support. Thus began a half-century of American antagonism toward Cuba. Finally, in 1961, he gave the United States 48 hours to reduce the staff of its embassy in Havana to 18 from 60. A frustrated Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba and closed the embassy on the Havana seacoast. The diplomatic stalemate lasted until 2015, when embassies were finally reopened in both Havana and Washington. During his 2 years in the mountains, Mr. Castro had sketched a social revolution whose aim, at least on the surface, seemed to be to restore the democracy that Mr. Batista's coup had stifled. Mr. Castro promised free elections and vowed to end American domination of the economy and the working class oppression that he said it caused. Having a law degree, Mr. Castro had no real experience in economics or government. Beyond improvising education and reducing Cuba's dependence on sugar and the United States, his revolution began without a clear sense of the new society he planned, except that it would be different from what had existed under Mr. Batista. At that time, Cuba was playground for rich American tourists, and gangsters were glaring disparities of wealth persisted, although the country was one of the most economically advanced in the Caribbean. After taking power in 1959, Mr. Castro put together a cabinet of moderates, but it did not last long. He named Felipe Pazos, an economist, president of the Banco Nacional de Cuba, Cuba's central bank. But when Mr. Pazos openly criticized Mr. Castro's growing tolerance of communists and his failure to restore democracy, he was dismissed. In place of Mr. Pazos, Mr. Castro named Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor who knew nothing about monetary policy, but whose revolutionary credentials were unquestioned. Opposition to the Castro government began to grow in Cuba, leading peasants and anti-communist insurgents to take up arms against it. Escambray Revolt, as it's called, lasted from 1959 to 1965, when it was crushed by Mr. Castro's army. Waves of Cuban exiles arrived in Miami and northern New Jersey after the revolution. Many were intent on overthrowing the man they had once supported. Their number would eventually total 1 million, many from what had been proportionately the largest middle class in Latin America. The Central Intelligence Agency helped train an exile army to retake Cuba by force. The army was to make a Bay of Pigs, a remote spot on Cuba's southern coast, and instigate a popular insurrection. Mr. Salk, then correspondent for the Times, had picked up information about the invasion and had written an article about it. at the request of the Kentucky administration, withheld some of what Mr. Solzek had found, including information that an attack was imminent. Specific references to the CIA were also admitted. 10 days later, on April the 17th of 1961, 1,500 Cuban fighters landed at the Bay of Pigs. Mr. Castro was waiting for them. The invasion was badly planned and by all accounts doomed. Most of the invaders were either captured or killed. Promised American air support never arrived. The historian Theodore Draper called the botched operation a perfect failure, and the invasion aroused a distrust of the United States that Mr. Castro exploited for political gain for the rest of his life. Declaration or deception? The CIA, fighting the Cold War, had acted out of worries about Mr. Castro's increasingly open communist connections. As he consolidated power, even some of his most faithful supporters grew concerned. One break had taken place as early as 1959. Who had fought alongside Mr. Castro in the Sierra Maestra, resigned as military governor of Camagüey province to protest the communist growing influence, as well as the appointment of Raul Castro, whose communist sympathies were well known. Armed forces, suspecting an anti-revolutionary plot, Fidel Castro had arrested and charged with treason. Within 2 months, Mr. Maestro was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. When he was released in 1979, Mr. Maestro, nearly blind, went into exile in the United States, where he lived until his death in 2014. Shortly after arriving in Miami and joining the legions of Castro's opponents there, Mr. Maestro told View magazine, "I differed from Fidel Castro because the original objective of our revolution was freedom or death. Once Castro had power, he began to kill freedom." Until just before the Bay of Pigs invasion, that Mr. Castro declared publicly that his revolution was socialist. A few months later, on December the 2nd, 1961, he removed any lingering doubt about his loyalties when he affirmed in a long speech, "I am a Marxist-Leninist." Many Cubans who had willingly accepted the great sacrifice for what they believed would be democratic revolution were dismayed. They broke ranks with Mr. Castro, putting themselves and their families at risk. Others, from the safety of the United States, publicly accused Mr. Castro of betraying the revolution and called him a tyrant, to raise doubts about his intention. As I listened, I thought that surely he must be a superb actor. Mr. Castro's sister Juanita wrote in an account in Life magazine in 1964. Referring to the December 61 speech. He had fooled not only many of his friends, but his family as well. She recalled his upbringing as son of a well-to-do landowner in eastern Cuba who had sent Jesuit school. In 1948, after Mr. Castro married Mirta Diaz Balart, whose family had ties with the Batista government, his father gave them a 3-month honeymoon in the United States. How could Fidel, who had been given the best of everything, be a communist? Juanita Castro wrote, "This was the riddle which paralyzed me and so many other Cubans who refused to believe that the leading our country into the communist camp." Though the young Fidel was deeply involved in radical student movement at the University of Havana, his early allegiance to communist doctrine was uncertain at best. The obstructionist attitudes of American officials had pushed Mr. Castro toward the Soviet Union. Indeed, although Mr. Castro pursued communist policies, he never established a purely communist state in Cuba, nor did he adopt Orthodox Communist Party ideology. Rather, what developed in Cuba was less doctrinaire, a tropical form of communism that suited his needs. He centralized the economy and flattened out much of the traditional hierarchy of Cuban society, improving education and health care for many Cubans, free speech, and economic opportunity. But unlike other communist countries, Cuba was never governed by a functioning how's this pronounced? Politburo, I guess, Burrow. Time to take a drink if you're doing the drinking game. I probably boogered that up. Mr. Castro himself and later his brother Raul filled all important positions in the party, the government, and the army, ruling Cuba as its maximum leader. The Cuban regime turns out to be simply the case of a third world dictator seizing a useful ideology in order to employ its wealth against his enemies, wrote the columnist Georgie Ann Geyer, whose critical biography of Mr. Castro was published in 1991. In this view of Mr. Castro, he was above all old-style Spanish caudillo, one of long line of Latin American strongmen who endeared themselves to people searching for leaders. The analyst Alvaro Vargas Llosa of the Independent Institute in Washington called him the ultimate 20th century. In Cuba, through good times and bad, Mr. Castro's supporters referred to themselves not as communists but as Fidelistas. He remained personally popular among segments of Cuban society, even after his economic policies created severe hardships. As Mr. Castro consolidated power, eliminated his enemies, and grew increasingly autocratic, the Cuban people referred to him simply as Fidel. To say Castro was considered disloyal, although in later decades Cubans would commonly just say that and mean it, or they would invoke his overwhelming presence by simply bringing a hand to their chins as if to stroke a beard. Global brinkmanship. Mr. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union meant the Cold War between the world's superpowers and the ideological battle between democracy and communism had erupted in the United States' sphere of influence. A clash was all but inevitable, and it came on October 1962. Planes took reconnaissance photos suggesting that the Soviets had exploited their new alliance to build bases in Cuba for intermediate-range nuclear missiles capable of reaching North America. Mr. Castro allowed the bases to be constructed, but once they were discovered, he became a bit player in the ensuing drama, overshadowed by President John F. Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita S. Khrushchev. Kennedy put United States military forces on alert and ordered naval blockade of Cuba. The two sides were at a stalemate for 13 tense days, and the world held its breath. Assurances that the United States would remove American missiles from Turkey and not invade Cuba, the Soviets withdrew the missiles and dismantled the bases. In Cuba continued to grow. Soviet troops, technicians, and engineers streamed in, eventually producing a generation of blonde Cubans with names like Yuri and Vladimiro were willing to buy all the sugar Cuba could produce. Caribbean nations diversified. Cuba decided to stick with one major crop, sugar, and one major buyer. But after forcing the entire nation into a failed effort to reach a record 10 million ton sugar harvest in 1970, Mr. Castro recognized the need to break the cycle of dependence on Soviets and sugar, on his belief in himself and a revolution for solutions. One likely consequence was his effort to develop a Cuban super cow. Although he had no training in animal husbandry, Mr. Castro decided to crossbreed humpbacked Asian zebus with standard Holsteins to create a new breed that could produce milk at prodigious rates. Zebus could still be found grazing in pastures across the island, symbols of Mr. Castro's micromanagement. This did give more milk, and one that set milk production record was stuffed and placed in a museum. No better producers than their parents. As Soviets settled in Cuba in the 1960s, hundreds of Cuban students were sent to Moscow, Prague, and other cities of the Soviet bloc to study science and medicine. Admirers from around the world, including some Americans, were impressed with the way literacy in Cuba had improved. A reshaping of Cuban society was underway. Cuba's tradition of racial was turned upside down as peasants from the countryside, many of them dark-skinned descendants of Africans enslaved by the Spaniards centuries before, were invited to Havana and other cities that had been overwhelmingly white. They were given keys to the elegant homes and spacious apartments of the middle-class fled to the United States. Rents came to be little more than symbolic, and basic foods like milk and eggs were sold in government stores at below production cost. Those early overhauls also changed Cuba in ways that were less than utopian. Foreign-born priests were exiled, local clergy were harassed so much that many closed their churches. The Roman Catholic Church excommunicated Mr. Castro for violating the 1949 papal decree against supporting communism. He established a sinister symbol of local committees for the defense of the revolution, which set neighbors to informing on neighbors. Thousands of dissidents and homosexuals were rounded up and sentenced to either prison or forced labor. And although blacks were welcomed into the cities, Mr. Castro's government remained overwhelmingly white. Mr. Castro regularly fanned the flames of revolution with his oratory. He incited the Cuban people by laying out what he considered the evils of capitalism and of the United States in particular. For decades, the regime controlled all publications and broadcasting outlets and restricted access to goods and information in ways that would not have been possible if Cuba were not an island. His revolution established at home, Mr. Castro looked to export it. Thousands of Cuban soldiers were sent to Africa to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia in support of communist insurgents. The strain on Cuba's treasury and its society was immense, but Mr. Castro insisted on being a global player in the communist struggle. As a potential threat to his rule were eliminated, Mr. Castro tightened his grip. Camilo Cienfuegos, division in the insurrection and was immensely popular in Cuba, was killed in a plane crash days after going to arrest Huber Matos in on Mr. Castro's orders. His body was never found. Che Guevara, who had become hostile toward the Soviet Union, broke with Mr. Castro before going off to Bolivia, where he was captured and killed in 1967 for trying to incite revolution there. Fiery rhetoric from Mr. Castro, early years of the revolution, Washington did attempt a reconciliation. By some accounts, in the weeks before he was assassinated in 1963, Kennedy looked at mending fences, providing Mr. Castro was willing to break with the Soviets. But with Kennedy's assassination and suspicions that Mr. Castro and the Cubans were somehow involved, the 90 miles separating Cuba from the United States became a gulf of antagonism and mistrust. The CIA tried several times to eliminate Mr. Castro or undermine his authority. One plot involved exposing him to a chemical that would cause his beard to fall out, and another using a poison pen to kill him. Mr. Castro often boasted of how many times he had escaped CIA plots to kill him. About the foiled attempts to be put on display at a Havana museum. Relations between the United States and Cuba briefly thawed in the 1970s during the administration of President Jimmy Carter. For the first time, Cuban Americans were allowed to visit family in Havana under strict guidelines, but that fleeting detente ended in 1980 when Mr. Castro tried to diffuse growing domestic discontent by allowing about 125,000 Cubans to flee in boats, makeshift rafts, and inner tubes, departing from the beach at Mariel. He used the opportunity to empty Cuban prisons of criminals and people with mental illness and force them to join the Mariel boat lift. Successor, Reagan, slammed shut the door that Mr. Carter had opened. In 1989, when frustrated veterans from Cuba's African ventures began rallying around General Arnaldo Ochoa, who led Cuban forces on the continent, Mr. Castro effectively got rid of potential rival by bringing the general and some of his supporters to trial on drug charges. Ochoa and several other high-ranking officers were executed on the orders of Raul Castro, who was then Minister of Defense. Economic embargo imposed by Eisenhower and widened by Kennedy has continued for more than 5 decades, but its effectiveness was undermined by the Soviet Union, which gave Cuba $5 billion a year in subsidies, and later by Venezuela, which sent Cuba badly needed oil and long-term economic support, including close United States allies like Canada, maintained relations with Cuba throughout the decades and continued trading with the island. In recent years, successive American presidents have punched big holes in the embargo, allowing economic activity, though maintaining a ban on tourism. The end of an empire. I faced my greatest challenge after I turned 60, Mr. Castro said in an interview with Vanity Fair magazine in 1994. He was referring to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which brought an end to the subsidies that had kept his government afloat for so long, a steady source of oil and reliable buyer for Cuban sugar. Abandoned, isolated, facing increased dissent at home, Mr. Castro seemed to have come to the end of his line. Cuba's collapse appeared imminent, and Mr. Castro's final hours in power were widely anticipated. Miami exiles began making elaborate preparations for a triumphant return. But Mr. Castro, defying predictions, fought on. He chose an unlikely weapon, the hatred American dollar, which he had long condemned as corrupt symbol of capitalism. In the summer of 1993, he made it legal for Cubans to hold American dollars spent by tourists or sent by exiled family members. It led to a dual currency system that has fostered resentment and hampered economic development in Cuba. Mr. Castro, the self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist, was also willing to experiment with capitalism, at least for a time. Encouraged by his brother Raul, he allowed farmers to sell excess produce at market rates. He ordered officials to turn a blind eye to small family-run kitchens and restaurants called paladeros that charged market prices. Under Raul Castro, those reforms were broadened considerably, though they were sometimes met with public grumbling from his older brother. But despite his apparent distaste for capitalism and lingering memories of the 1950s, Cuba ceded his rule. Fidel Castro continued to foster Cuba's tourism industry. Italian and Canadian companies to develop resort hotels and vacation properties, usually in association with an arm of the Cuban military. The resorts were off limits to most Cubans. They generated hard cash, but new generation of struggling young Cuban women were lured into prostitution by tourist money. And Canadian investors poured money into decrepit telephone company owned by ITT until it was nationalized by Mr. Castro in 1960. And other enterprises which helped Cuba's economy from collapsing. He declared an emergency during which he expected the Cuban people to tighten their belts. He called the United States embargo genocide. All his efforts were not enough to keep dissent from sprouting in Havana, Santiago de Cuba, and other urban areas during this period of hardship. Condemnation of his actions, Mr. Castro clamped down on fledgling democratic movement, jailing anyone who dared call for free elections. He also cracked down on the nucleus of an independent press, imprisoning or harassing Cuban reporters and editors. In 1994, for the first time, demonstrators took to the streets of Havana to express their anger over the failed promises of the revolution. Mr. Castro had to personally appeal for calm. Then in early 1996, he seized an opportunity to rebuild his support, demonizing the United States. A South Florida group, Brothers to the Rescue, had been flying 3 civilian planes toward Cuban coast when 2 were shot down by Cuban military jets. 4 men on board were killed. Mr. Castro raged against Washington, maintaining that the planes had violated Cuban airspace, and condemned the attack. Until then, President Bill Clinton had been moving discreetly but steadily toward easing the United States embargo and reestablishing some relations with Cuba. But in the wake of the attack and the virulent reaction from Cuban Americans in Florida, a state Mr. Clinton considered important to his re-election bid, he reluctantly signed the Helms-Burton Law, which allowed the United States to punish foreign companies that were using confiscated American property in Cuba. The State Department's first warning under the new law went to a Canadian mining company that had taken over a huge nickel mine, a Mexican investment group that had purchased the Cuban telephone company. Despite protests from American allies, the Cuban states maintained the Helms-Burton Law as a weapon against Mr. Castro, though all its provisions have never been carried out. But in Cuba, the American actions reinforced Mr. Castro's complaints about Americans and helped channel domestic dissent toward Washington. One of his strengths as a communicator, he considered Reagan as only worthy in that regard, and had always been to transform his anger toward the United States into a rallying cry for the Cuban people. The honor of being one of the few adversaries of the United States, Mr. Castro told Maria Shriver of NBC in 1998 interview. When Ms. Shriver asked him if that truly was an honor, he answered, "Of course. For such a small country as Cuba to have such a gigantic country as the United States live so with this island, it is an honor for us," he said. Parallel lives. As he grew older and grayer, Mr. Castro could no longer easily be linked to the intense guerrilla fighter who had come out of Sierra Maestra. He rambled incoherently in his long speeches. He was rumored to be suffering from various diseases. After 40 years, the revolution he started no longer held promise, and the Cubans by the thousands, including many who had never known any other life but under Mr. Castro, risked their lives trying to reach the United States on rafts, inner tubes, and even old trucks boats. Although the revolution lost its luster, what never diminished was Mr. Castro's ability to confound American officials and to create situations to seize the advantage of a particular moment. That was evident early in 1998 when Pope John Paul II visited Havana and met with Mr. Castro, widely expected to be seen as a rebuke and an embarrassment to Mr. Castro. The aging anti-communist pontiff stood beside the aging communist leader who had abandoned his military uniform for the occasion in favor of a dark suit. Human rights and the lack of basic freedoms in Cuba, but he also called Washington's embargo unjust and ethically unacceptable, allowing Mr. Castro to claim political, if not moral, victory. The next year, Mr. Castro converted to another conflict into the opportunity to bolster his standing among his own people while infuriating the United States. A young woman and her 5-year-old son were among more than a dozen Cubans who had set out for Florida in a 17-foot aluminum boat. The boat capsized and the woman drowned. Leon Gonzalez survived inner tube before being picked up by the United States Coast Guard and taken to Miami, where he was united with relatives. Later, however, the relatives refused to release the boy when his father in Cuba demanded his return. The standoff between the family and the United States officials created the kind of emotional and political drama that Mr. Castro had become master at manipulating for his own purposes. Mr. Castro made the boy another symbol of American oppression, which diverted attention from the deteriorating conditions in Cuba. After several months, American agents seized the boy from the Miami relatives and returned him to his father in Cuba, where he was greeted by Mr. Castro. That episode carried great significance for Mr. Castro in the way it echoed one personal life. Mr. Castro and his wife, Merta Diaz-Balart, divorced in 1955, 6 years after the birth of their son, Leo. In 1956, when Mr. Castro and Ms. Diaz-Balart were both in Mexico, Mr. Castro arranged to have the boy visit him before embarking on what he said would be a dangerous voyage, his invasion of Cuba. He promised to bring the boy back in 2 weeks, but it was a trick. Mr. Castro placed Fidelio in the custody of a friend in Mexico City. He then sailed for Cuba and his fellow rebels on the yacht Grandma. The boy's mother, with the help of her family and the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, found a team of professional kidnappers who ambushed the boy and his guardians in the park and carried him off. Took Fidelio to New York and enrolled him in a local school for a year, but after Mr. Castro entered Havana and grabbed control of the government, he persuaded his former wife to send the boy back. Castro lived in Cuba until years later he was sent to the Soviet Union to study. He became a physicist, married a Russian woman, and eventually returned to Cuba, where he was named head of Cuba's nuclear power program. Mr. Castro's personal life were always murky. He had no formal home, but lived in many different houses and estates in and around Havana. Several women, and only in his later years was he willing to acknowledge that he had a relationship of more than 40 years with Dalia Soto del Valle, and seen in public. Whether they were legally married or not was not clear. The two had 5 sons: Alexis, Alexander, Alejandro, Antonio, and Angel, all of whom live in Cuba. Mr. Castro also has a daughter, Alina, a radio host in Miami, who bitterly attacked her father on the air for years. Mr. Castro had stormy relations with many of his relatives, both in Cuba and the United States. To Celia Sanchez, a woman who was with him in Sierra Maestra and who looked after his schedule and his archives devotedly until she died in 1980. Angela Castro died at 88 in Havana in February 2012, according to the Associated Press, quoting her sister Juanita. And his elder brother, Ramon, died in February of 2016 at the age of 91. Outlasting all his enemies, Mr. Castro lived to rule a country where the overwhelming majority of people had never known any other leader. Hardly anyone talked openly of a time without him until the day in 2001 when he appeared to faint while giving a speech. Then in 2004, he stumbled while leaving a platform, breaking a kneecap and reminding Cubans again of his mortality and forcing them to confront their future. When his revolution aged, Cuban dissidents grew bolder. Oswald Paya, using a clause in the Cuban Constitution, collected thousands of signatures in a petition demanding a referendum on free speech and other political freedoms. Mr. Paya died in a car crash in 2012. Sparingly of Mr. Castro and the regime, although most of their missives could not be read in Cuba, where internet access was strictly limited. A group of Cuban women who called themselves the Ladies in White rallied on Sundays to protest the imprisonment of their fathers, husbands, and sons, whose pictures they carried on posters inscribed with a number of years to which they were sentenced as political prisoners. Made his brother's successor, try that again, after being made his brother's successor, try that. Raul Castro tried to control the fragments of the revolution that remained after Fidel Castro fell ill, including a close association with President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who modeled himself after Fidel. Died in 2013. Never as popular as his brother, Raul Castro was considered a better manager and in some ways was seen as more conscious of the everyday needs of Cuban people, despite his reputation as the revolution's executioner. One of the first moves as leader was to replace the grossly overcrowded city buses known as the new ones, many imported from China. He opened up the economy somewhat, allowing entrepreneurs to start businesses, and he eased restrictions on traveling, phones, computers, and other personal items, and the buying and selling of property. Still, Raul Castro came under mounting pressure from Cubans demanding even more economic and political opportunity. He took more steps to open the economy and, in so doing, dismantled parts of the socialist state that his brother had defended for so long. And as Raul Castro embarked on the new course was the brooding visage of Fidel, been seen as a rebellion of one man. When President Obama and Raul Castro simultaneously went on TV in their countries in 2014 to announce a prisoner exchange and the first steps toward normalizing relations, Cubans and Americans alike expected to hear Fidel either accepting or condemning the moves. After the deal was announced, Mr. Castro, or someone writing in his name, finally reacted in a way that combined his own bluster and his brother's new approach. I do not trust the politics of the United States, nor have I exchanged a word with them. But this is not in any way a rejection of the peaceful solution to conflicts, Mr. Castro wrote near the end of a rambling letter to students on the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of his University of Havana. Sounding more like his brother than his old self, he backed any peaceful attempts to resolve the problem between the two countries. He then took one final swipe at his old enemies. The grave dangers that threaten humanity today have to give way to norms that were or that are compatible with human dignity, the letter said. No country is excluded from such rights. With this spirit, I have fought and will continue fighting until my last breath. 16, frail Mr. Castro made what many thought would be his last public appearance at the 7th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party, dressed in an incongruous blue tracksuit jacket, his hands at times quivering and his once powerful voice reduced to a tiny squawk. He expressed surprise at having survived to almost 90, and he bade farewell to the party, the political system in Cuba he had created. Soon I will be like everybody else, Mr. Castro said. Our turn comes to us all. Cuban communism will endure. No one is sure if the force of the revolution will dissipate without Mr. Castro and eventually his brother, but Fidel Castro's impact on Latin America and the Western Hemisphere has the aim of lasting indefinitely. The power of his personality remains inescapable, for better or for worse, but also throughout Latin America. We're going to live with Fidel Castro and all he stands for while he's alive, wrote Mr. Matthews of the Times, whose own fortunes were dimmed considerably by his connection to Mr. Castro and with his ghost when he is dead. So there's the information on Castro and his legacy, I suppose. Gives you a little history.